Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. I'm having to re-record injuries to the cervix section from line 5, which we're working our way through. I didn't realize till I went in and checked that I had actually recorded myself doing my research and typing and then turned it off and spoke to a camera that wasn't running. I need enough money that I have a cinematographer, engineer, whatever it is you want to call it. But at any rate, we're looking at the section injuries to the cervix. And what I want to look at, I'm just going to run real quick through the deaths I already had and through 3 non-fatal cases I need more injury on. But there's one where abortion docs had the medical board document. And so I wrote up a whole post about it. So the links to the deaths and the link to Jane that we're going to focus on are all in the link below. And I cannot stress enough, even if you are supportive of your local abortion clinic and you think that they are the greatest thing since sliced bread, go ahead and get copies of these reports where they pass their annual inspections with flying colors and send it in. Operation Rescue isn't picky. You can have that so-and-so got such and such award, and they'll post it. They're not fussy. As long as it's about that clinic or about that practitioner, you send it in, they'll post it. So go to abortiondocs.org. Brag up your local clinic if you think they're the bee's knees. Go ahead. No problem. They will post it. Okay. So the deaths that Mark classified as injuries to the cervix, I've already said I think the way he classified the cases by injury was silly because you get multiple injuries and ultimately a cause of death. But these are the ones that Crutcher put under injuries to the cervix. We have Margaret Louise Smith, who traveled from Ypsilanti, Michigan, kind of following their local criminal abortionist who had gone to New York to set up a safe and legal practice when New York legalized in 1970. She went there on June 16th of 1971 after being told she'd been exposed to rubella, so she was afraid her baby might be disabled. She went there, and Ketchum did what's called hysterectomy abortions, which is just a C-section where the baby's going to die of extreme prematurity, or just going to die because you neglect it. Basically, you're intending to not let the baby live. And Ketchum was doing these in his office. You're having to cut the uterus open enough, cut it open enough to get the fetus out. He was doing this in his office. And the way he would do it, instead of going through abdominally, he'd go up through the vagina and he'd cut up open above the cervix and pull out the baby and let it gasp out its last breath. But it looks like he didn't even bother sewing her shut after he did this, because the boyfriend came in the afternoon to pick Margaret up, and he pleaded with the staff, do something, look at her, she's in horrible shape. So they called an ambulance, and Margaret was pronounced dead at a hospital that was across the street. That's how close help was. And God knows Ketchum and his staff standing around with their thumbs up their butts, which seems to be fairly typical in abortion clinics. And it was less than 6 months later that Ketchum caused similar fatal injuries to a young woman from Ohio named Carol Shaner. Then we have Evelyn Dudley. Dr. Theodore Roosevelt Mason Howard was a very high-profile civil rights activist, and he opened what originally had apparently been intended as a free clinic, just a place where low-income people down on their luck could come and get medical care, and somehow he wound up turning it into a seedy abortion mill. And Evelyn Dudley bled to death after an abortion there in 1973. And 2 other women, Dorothy Brown and Julia Rogers, also died after abortions at Friendship. Then we have Sherry Graham. She's the death that Carol Everett describes in her book Blood Money. Carol called her Cheryl, but we were able to kind of narrow down the time span to a several-year period, and we just went looking for autopsy reports related to abortion. And now Carol says that Harvey just couldn't be bothered to stitch up the laceration in Sherry's cervix because his girlfriend had a picture of margaritas and was nagging for him to come home. But what is clear is that she was sent home with an unsutured cervical laceration and she bled to death. Then we have 16-year-old Patricia Chacon. She went to Fast Eddie Allred's Family Planning Associates Medical Group for an abortion in 1984. And it looks like Allred might have actually performed the abortion herself. And Patricia's family said that she was left alone to bleed to death while Allred attended to other patients. Mary Pena, Josefina Garcia, Kyla Ellis, and Maria Rodriguez also bled to death after abortions at an Allred owned and operated clinic. So that makes a total of 5 hemorrhage deaths. And then patients Denise Holmes, Joyce Hortenzio, Tammy Sumatsu, Susan Levy, Deanna Bell, Christine Mora, Tanisha Wesson, Maria Lejo, Kimberly Neal, Nakia Jordan, Chanel Bryant, Natalie Myers, and Lenice Dorsey died from other types of complications from abortions at this National Abortion Federation flagship group of clinics. Then we have Sylvia Moore. She was 18 years old when she went to the notorious Dr. Arnold Bickham on New Year's Eve of 1986. He ripped her cervix up, put a hole in her uterus, and actually left the plastic tip of an instrument embedded in that. When he decided it was time for her to leave, she was so weak she couldn't even stand up, so he plunked her in a wheelchair and shoved her out the door to bleed to death. The medical examiner was so appalled by this that he declared the manner of death to be homicide, but nobody did anything. You know, ADN, look it up. Then we have Katrina Poole, who was 16 when she went to a clinic in Florida. When the doctor started the abortion, he realized he was getting a lot more placental tissue than he should have, and in the middle of it estimated that she had not been fewer than 12 weeks pregnant. She was actually 22 weeks pregnant. He wrangled with the abortion for a while, then sent her home. That evening, Katrina took her meds, kissed her mother goodnight, and went to bed, and they found her dead the next morning, bled to death from a torn cervix and ruptured uterus. And then Mary Ann Dancy had an abortion performed at Fleming Center in North Carolina. Dr. Clarence Washington performed it, said there were no complications, sent her home. She bled heavily, but nobody from the clinic returned her calls. July 28th, which was the day after the abortion, she was taken to the hospital by ambulance, but she bled to death during emergency surgery from hemorrhage due to a lacerated cervix. Then I list 3 cases below where if you can access these court documents, please do. One was a young woman named Charlotte who went for a legal abortion and wound up having her cervix and uterus lacerated. When she sued to try to recoup the costs of her medical care, the doctor argued that she'd signed an arbitration agreement prior to the abortion, so he was on the hook for a maximum of $15,000, and Charlotte would be the one that would have to pay for the cost of arbitration. A young woman named Tina had an abortion. Afterwards, she suffered bleeding, nausea, and vomiting, fell asleep on the couch in the clinic waiting room, and Roe didn't even examine her before discharging her from the clinic. After she got home, she passed a large clot, started bleeding profusely, and lost consciousness, and she was taken to a hospital where doctors performed a hysterectomy to save her life. And then Teresa went to a female National Abortion Federation member. It's in Kentucky. I'm not sure who she was. She suffered a perforated cervix causing substantial blood loss, and she lost her uterus and her right fallopian tube of ovary and part of her colon. So if you follow the link below, I have the names and numbers of the court documents if you could look for them. And again, send them, let me know, but also send them to abortiondocs.org, and so that Operation Rescue can post them. And again, like I said, if you're pro-choice and you think your local abortion clinic or practitioner is the greatest thing since sliced bread, go ahead, get copies of things praising them. Get awards they got, proof that they've got a license in good standing, their educational background, whatever, send it. Operation Rescue's not too proud. They'll post it. Then we have the case of a woman that she's identified as MB by her initials in the medical board document, which I provide a link to in the link below. Crutcher called her Jane for some reason. Generally, if the initial was M, we'd have named her something like Mary or Maria or Marion or Margot, but Jane it was. The really interesting thing about her case is if you follow the link and you look at the medical board document, there were some doctors who had some serious criticism of what Steven Chase Brigham did. He was doing a 26-week abortion in his office, only did one round of dilation for a second trimester abortion, continued to pull out bony pieces of the skull even when he was having difficulty doing so. And when he was having trouble suturing a tear in her cervix, he just kind of kept her and monitored her for a while before finally taking her to the hospital. And it turned out that a bony piece of the skull had torn her cervix and also severed a uterine artery. And the artery spasmed. Apparently that's something that can happen after a severing, and it filled up with clots. And it wasn't until the clots started to break down that Jane started to tank, and they did the hysterectomy to save her life. And one of the things I find really interesting is that the abortionist testified to the medical board, oh, this kind of stuff happens to me, I have no blame for him. And the other doctors are like, this was appalling. And the medical board sided with the abortionist because, well, you know, if this is just normal, every so often you don't have them dilated quite enough and you pull out a piece of bony skull and it severs an artery and she has to have a hysterectomy, well, you know, then that's what happens, no big deal. So again, follow the link. I have just a paragraph about Jane, but if you click on the link to Jane, I do take you to a more in-depth retelling of what happened, what Brigham did, and what different doctors had to say, and of course a link to the medical board document.